organizations. I worked with various different organizations, and so I'm really excited to be here. So before I just begin, I know that there was a land acknowledgement done in the beginning of this conference, but I wanted to do one again. I know folks are coming from different places. I'm personally coming from Treaty 7, which is Calgary. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about a land acknowledgement, because I know that folks have been doing it a lot these days, and what does it mean? And I absolutely love this quote by Mary Lyons that says, when we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us, and they're around us, as you all do. I love the last part, as you all do. And I think it's so important when we're trying to do land acknowledgements, or even thinking about land acknowledgements, that we understand that we all have history, that we all have blood, that we all have a past, a current, and a future that relates to the land. And that's why it's so important to do this. And spanning generations, land acknowledgements are a traditional custom of Indigenous people when welcoming outsiders onto their land, into their homes, to build respectful relationships, acknowledging that the land is an important part of reconciliation. It also honors the authentic history of North America, its original peoples, and tells a story of creation that has essentially been missing historically. So just quickly, for Treaty 7 territory land, in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani First Nation, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda, and also the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their home in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So I'd like to begin with just putting out a fact out there, which is a little bit more about events, but also how to communicate about events and what to do about it. Essentially, about 2 months ago, we were Zoom bombed with racist rhetoric. We had an anti-racism arts festival, which is something that we have every year, that is something that happens in a different city every year. It's organized by local organizations, but we like to empower them and help them as much as we can. And unfortunately, the incident happened where somebody hacked into the system. They said the N-word for at least 45 seconds with rap music in the back that was actually directly directed at a panelist who is Black. So you can obviously understand that it was a very traumatic experience and incident, because the entire system was hacked and we weren't actually able to exit that medium until at least 45 seconds after, and it caused a lot of damage. And this taught me a lot about anti-racist public relations when it comes particularly to event management and planning, particularly with partners, because this festival is something that is actually run and organized entirely by partners, not necessarily us. We try to help them as much as we can, but it's always a local initiative, and we want it to be a local initiative. Because if you're doing work in the community, you actually want the folks who are in the community to be involved. And I want to talk a little bit about accountability here, because it's just so important that when something as traumatic as this happens, that we actually hold ourselves accountable. And yes, Zoom needs to be held accountable. They need to have better security systems. They need to work on technology to potentially or somehow remove certain types of language from being displayed, or imagery and whatnot. But also you need to hold yourself accountable as an organization. So myself, my organization, our partners, whoever else is involved or in the planning actually needs to hold ourselves accountable. And I love Mia Ming's 4 parts of accountability. You can easily Google it, where she talks about how to give a genuine apology and what does true accountability really mean. And this is my favorite quote from it: true accountability is not only apologizing, understanding the impacts of your actions have caused on yourself and others, making amends or reparations to the harmed parties, but most importantly, true accountability is changing your behavior so that the harm, violence, and abuse does not happen again. I think that's incredibly important when we're learning and we've made a mistake or we've learned from it, that we hold ourselves accountable and make sure that this does not happen again. So I want to talk a little bit about, say if you are an organization that perhaps wants to talk a little bit about racial justice or racial equity or even just race relations for events, and you can think of, you can get creative and think about how you can do this for other mediums as well, and not just events, but whether it's online or in person, these are the four things that you need to ensure you have. The subject matter expertise. So a lot of the times I've seen various different organizations kind of be like, hey, internally or externally, however they want to do it, we're going to have an event for Black History Month, for example, and they don't have that subject matter expertise. And it's not just as simple as having someone Black there. That's not how it works. They actually need to have that subject matter expertise of that history. Yes, lived experience is incredibly important and something that you need to have, but you also need to have subject matter expertise of somebody who's studied or learned about it to a grave extent or worked on that. Otherwise, your messaging can get mixed in there. They also need to have an anti-racist and trauma-informed lens. Racism is not an easy topic. It's traumatic experiences. The experience that I just brought up that happened during our event was incredibly traumatic to the person. In fact, it actually led to that person being diagnosed with PTSD afterwards due to the extreme effect that came out of it. So you need to not only have an anti-racist lens, which develops over years and over time, and it's an ongoing journey, but you also need to have a trauma-informed lens. Like, how do you deal with trauma? What are some next steps? Security is huge, whether it's online or in person. We've been doing events for about 12 years now with my foundation, and I literally, every time we have an in-person event, which we haven't had in a while because of COVID, we've had, either like threats or problematic people show up, or like white supremacy type of groups sharing the information. So when you're talking about, unfortunately, race relations, a lot of times this does get brought up. So you need to have security measures. Everybody needs to be aware. And this goes the same thing for online. I know online is, newer experience for people for a lot of these events, but you need to make sure that online you have security as well as backup plans. What if something racist happens and somebody interrupts your events? What is your backup plan? What is your security plan? And lastly, mental health support. Obviously to the victim, to the community, but also everyone who's attending the event, the other panelists. So however your event may be, it's so incredibly important to have that mental health support available for everyone. And this all needs to be done during your planning phase. So next I want to talk about how do you respond to it. So say if some sort of a crisis has happened, the example that I gave is one where, you were Zoom bombed. What do you do? And this is, similar to crisis communication, which is essentially you need to communicate about an unexpected crisis that's beyond your control, that involves your organization and requires an immediate response. So some quick things that you need to be aware of. You need to be quick. Waiting a long time is not going to help the situation. In fact, it's going to make the people who were victimized feel like they're not a priority. This is not important to you. You need to be truthful. So if you've made a mistake, regardless of the fact that we had security in place, we had all these different measures, clearly something fell through the cracks, and we need to be truthful about that. And this goes for any experience out there, that this is a failure and we would like to apologize. You need to express empathy. You need to promote action and accountability. Words are only words. If your press release or whatever it is that you put out there does not promote some sort of action, that we are going to work better, that we're going to do more, that doesn't really actually mean anything. And you need to be respectful and see things from the different perspective, empathize, and think about it like that when you're responding to a crisis. And just a few things I wanted to just bring up. So preparation, backup plan, and expectations. So when you're responding to a crisis, you need to be prepared. You need to have a backup plan in case this goes wrong, and you need to have expectations set, whether it's with your partners, your stakeholders, and whatever it may be. And that will help you with your crisis communication. You also need to have a debrief. So say if something occurs, you need to have a debrief with the parties that were involved, and try to help them, ask them, what can I do to help you? And this will actually help with your relationship with your partners, organizations, or the person who's victimized, or whoever it may be. Again, this can work in various different circumstances, so you'll just have to be creative. I'm kind of focusing more on an event here, but you can definitely see how this would work for different situations. For example, if you're an organization, an arts organization, and you have some sort of an art piece that's out there that causes a lot of controversy, particularly relating to race relations, as soon as it happens, you need to have a debrief with everybody involved. You need to hear them out. You need to be respectful, and you need to actually consider what they're saying. And then you need to acknowledge what happened. And I think this is one of the biggest things that people don't do, unfortunately. They don't acknowledge what happened. They like to just push it aside and be like, well, we don't want this media attention. We don't want people thinking negatively about us. But actually, when you don't acknowledge what happened, people do think negatively about you, and they hold that against you as well. So it's incredibly important to acknowledge what's actually happened through various forms of communication that you put out there. And also follow up. Like, clearly what happened is not good, and you need to give that support to folks, whether it's mental health support or other types of support. You can ask them what they can do. You can create a list of things that you can do as an organization, but follow-up is incredibly important. We all know how important communications is because we're in this field. So following up is really important. A lot of the times when things happen, some sort of a crisis communication, sometimes people will put a press release out there, and that's kind of it. And now you need the dust to settle, and that's it. But you're not following up. You're not holding yourself accountable. The person will automatically believe that you don't care. So follow up is important. And you should also report the incident depending on the nature. If it is hateful, like the incident that I just mentioned, it's incredibly important to report it to authorities or police services. And lastly, you need to improve. This is incredibly important, going back to the whole, if you've made mistakes, then you need to learn from them. So if you've, an incident has happened, some sort of crisis has happened, you need to improve with that. So you need to hold yourself accountable in that sense and say that next time I have an event, these are the different, or whatever it may be, these are the different criteria I need to have, and these are things that I need to make sure that I do. And it goes beyond just events. It can say, if you do have an event and something goes wrong, you actually need to ensure that other mediums or other ways that you communicate or other ways that you put messaging out there are also improving. So that's also important. Accountability is just so important when it comes to this topic. So that was just an example of an incident that kind of happened with us. That was more of an event, and I really thought it'd be important to point that out because this is based off of our experience and what we've learned. But really going back to the cultural competency and racially aware communications. With the worldwide focus on race relations, we've seen so many folks pushing, anti-racist messages since the death of George Floyd, which has been 1 year now, since he was brutally murdered by police. And folks are putting, we're all for racial justice out there. They're pushing ads. They're highlighting, we've given donation to these organizations. Look at the awesome work that we're doing. But then a lot of these businesses actually have no idea how to talk about it. And I feel like communications is one of the bigger lacking areas where they don't know how to talk about race. They don't know how to talk about racism. And that's why it's actually so incredibly important to be racially aware and culturally competent, because it's essentially unavoidable. You can't avoid it anymore. It's come to a point, thankfully so, where racial injustice has come to the limelight. And you can't push it aside anymore because it will affect your service, it will affect your brand, it'll affect your internal culture, it'll affect how your clients view you, and clients hold the power to demand. And they're increasingly demanding and demonstrating that they have that powerful voice. They will cancel your brand or whatever services that you may provide, or criticize it and publicly criticize it because they want to make sure that the companies meet those demands that they have. And organizations need to be incredibly mindful of that this is part of our new normal, that we are actually being held accountable as organizations, as service providers. And communications, of course, is a huge role in all of that. So that's why it is important to be culturally competent and racially aware in actually all sectors, not just communications. And that's where, you know, learning from yours and others' mistakes is so important, because mistakes are an important part of life. We all make them. We've made them. We're likely going to be making them again for various different reasons in life. And if you don't learn from them, it'll likely give you a lot of stress and humiliation. So that's why it's important to learn from them. And I'm going to give a few examples of sort of fails that other organizations have done that has not been ideal. A lot of them are like screen captures that I found through social media, just quickly based off of things that I remembered people tweeting, or Facebook messages and Instagram and things like that. And they're all kind of related to communications. So stay away from performance. This is huge. Here are some tweets. 1 year later, after the brutal murder of George Floyd, how's your timeline looking? Your workplace conversations, the focus of your work and advocacy. Is your solidarity performative? For the corporate communication folks, no racialized or indigenous person wants some performative corporate company statement today. Plan to track your performance against what you say today. This isn't time for thoughts and prayers. Know it, say it, and mean it. Beyond solidarity statements, question to ask yourself: how will you engage with critique from Black people whose experiences with your organization are shaped by anti-Black racism, who now find your solidarity statements hypocritical? So really going back to that piece that a lot of folks are putting information out there that this is how we feel, this is terrible, blah, 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 but then not doing anything about it. Thoughts and prayers aren't going to help anyone. And folks are well aware of that. So stay away from performance unless if you're actually going to do anything about it. And I hope you will do something about it. Be responsive and initiate change. I didn't want to grab screenshots for this because I didn't want to particularly target down on organizations and their failures for this because there's just so many examples out there. But essentially, I've seen lots of particularly government organizations. I think those are a good example. You know, say municipalities put, try to have diversity and inclusion in their imagery, for example. They take some photo shoots with a few people of color, they're great photos, and they try to incorporate that in their social media whenever they're kind of updating about some of the services that they have or programs. And then you get all these comments on there saying racist things, problematic statements on various mediums, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever it may be. And essentially, most of these organizations that I've seen, most of municipalities, provinces, even the federal government actually doesn't do anything about it. They actually allow the hate to fester and they continue being a bystander. So are you responsive and do you initiate change within your communication mediums? Do you actually do something about it? Do you have a policy? Do you respond with something? Do you delete those racist comments? For example, I recently saw a post by one of the municipalities that had like 600 comments and like 300 out of them were probably racist because it was very specific to an anti-racist program sort of thing that they had, and they just kind of left it in there. And that's incredibly problematic. I get it. You don't have time to go over 600 comments. Everybody in your office who's in your communications department and the social media department is probably working on campaigns and, really busy life. I get that. But what else can you do about it? Can you look more into the medium? Can you have a better policy in place? Can you have statements out there that are very straightforward, that are saying that, hey, we will not allow this and this is not okay, to let folks know that this is unacceptable. Whatever it is that your policy is in place, do you actually have something in place and are you responding to it? Because not responding to it actually shows that you're ignorant and you're being a bystander. You're allowing it to happen, which is the exact opposite of what you want. So it's so incredibly important to actually be responsive to all of that. You have a role in this. Even if you're not a police service or whatever it may be, it's still your job to make sure that hate is not festering in your mediums. And understand your limitations. This is a recent tweet about the Kamloops residential schools discovery of mass graves. This person says, please be careful with reporting on the Kamloops residential schools. Elders and survivors are extremely triggered. If you do not know how to do trauma-informed reporting, decline to write the story. Not all stories are yours to write. Do you know your limitations? Are you just putting yourself in the situation? And I guess a lot of this, sometimes it's even about higher ups, right? Like you're just a communicator, whatever your position is. You don't necessarily make the call in terms of what can you write about, what can you not write about. But do you understand that there are things that you're not aware of, like perhaps trauma-informed reporting? This would be very specific to journalism, but I can see this situation playing out in a lot of different ways. Are you aware that not all stories are yours to write, that you may not be culturally competent or understand protocols in a certain culture, particularly relationships with the Indigenous community? This is so incredibly important, as most people living on this land are settlers or immigrants. And we need to ensure that in the spirit of reconciliation, we're actually having a very meaningful and respectful relationship. So in order to do that, we need to understand certain things. We need to have that cultural competency. And if you don't, then it is about questioning that. It is about bringing it up to the higher ups that, hey, this will actually make your organization that I work for, us, look bad, because I don't have this knowledge, unless if you're willing to invest in this knowledge for us, to have that education. Say what you mean or don't say it at all, and be prepared for a response from the affected community. So there's something called woke washing, and it just won't cut it anymore. Folks are well aware. Blackout Tuesday is a really great example of that, where last year, everybody on Blackout Tuesday, a lot of folks anyway, had a black square that was specifically relating to the Black Lives Matter movement, just talking about racial justice and how something needs to be done. And the whole point of that was to amplify Black voices. I think the message was kind of lost in there because a lot of folks didn't understand the purpose of that. But if you posted that black square, you are going to be held accountable because you need to actually say what you mean. And I wanted to give a little bit of a better example that's very relevant as of right now, because it is June, which is Pride Month. So I wanted to talk just quickly about basically a woke washing example, which is called rainbow washing. And we see this everywhere. Like if you look at various different logos right now, just on the right here, we see it says rainbow washing. Everybody has a rainbow logo. So what does it look like? It's basically a company might be rainbow washing if they randomly during June use the LGBTQIA2S+ community members as props in content. They use the rainbow to push products. They have corporate groups marching in parades. They offer false incentives for queer talent. They underpay queer talent. They change logos temporarily. They make empty gestures. They foster an unsafe workplace for queer staff. They don't donate to the causes. They run a pride campaign while contributing to actually anti-LGBTQIA2S+ organizations or public figures. So that's what it looks like. And why is it damaging? Because you're commodifying an entire important movement that represents, the queer community's long history of resilience against oppression and strife. And you're just watering that down for your own incentive, for your own commodity. So for a lot of folks these days, for some reason, Pride has become more about, brand deals or sponsorships or celebrity appearances, amplifying queer voices and raising awareness for the issues. But it's also damaging if it's just well-intentioned people thinking that they're supporting the community, when in reality, they're actually just supporting, the multi-billion-dollar corporations, or having a performative action, a performative statement, again, just, showing that we support you through imagery or during a month, but not actually doing it through actions. So how can I be sure I'm actually supporting the cause or businesses and not buying into, rainbow washing? You support it all year round. You uplift queer employees all year round. Your support is actually transparent and clear in your statements. The support is actually measurable. It actually has outcomes. They address community issues, so they actually take feedback. They offer paid opportunities for queer folks instead of just asking for volunteer times and effort. And they speak up to impact the anti-LGBTQ plus 2S plus policy and legislation. So this is I know we're getting a little bit away from racial justice in this sense, although intersectionalities definitely play a role here, but this is a very relevant example of right now that you can look on social media, how so many organizations are rainbow washing, but they're not actually meaning it. Having well-intentioned or trying to do something as a commodity or monetization is not true allyship. So you need to make sure that, whether if you're going to have a black square or you're going to have your logo turned into a rainbow, you're actually supporting the community all year round through your actions. Another thing, you need to be aware of history. These are just, two brands I just quickly Googled, H&M, Dove campaign, where they clearly, the communicator, and I find this really hard in this day and age to not be aware of history or not to understand why certain things are problematic. So the H&M hoodie says coolest monkey in the jungle. Very evident why that's problematic. The Dove campaign speaks for itself why that's problematic, regardless of the well-intentioned or the person who wasn't aware of whatever they were doing. It doesn't cut it. You have an entire communications department. Even if you just have one person in your team, they need to be well aware, and that's why they need to have that racial justice or racial equity lens, because these mistakes harm your brand so much. And also, don't try so hard, because people will see through you if you're fake. And this is just a really quick example of something I quickly found on MAC Cosmetics a while ago, where suhoor is basically the time where folks wake up when they're about to fast during Ramadan. So it's morning, a lot of times it's 4 a.m. So saying get ready for a glamorous suhoor look in a few easy steps is actually really weird because nobody's going to get up at 4 a.m. and do their makeup like this, or even have outfits. They're probably wearing their pajamas and maybe have washed their face, depending on how life is treating them currently. So it's a little bit strange to try and commodify that, and people will see right through you. So you need to be incredibly genuine in that. Be respectful. Some tweets here. Do not reach out to survivors. Do not ask for statements from communities. Again, this is relating to the mass graves at the residential school in Kamloops. In their teachings, we all take pause together as people grieve. We have strict protocols around grieving, and if you are uninformed about those, then don't write the story. You need to be respectful. You need to be aware. I can't tell you how many organizations that I've worked with that have been like, oh, we want to do this and that, and this, it's going to be awesome, and it's going to be inclusive. We're going to involve these communities, like particularly working with elders, but then they don't know the protocol. They don't know how to engage the community, and they actually end up offending the community and actually creating more harm than good, and not building that relationship. You don't just build relationships by saying, hey, I'm going to do this awesome thing. I'll see you there. I need this, this, and that from you, without actually understanding how that community is affected and how to engage with them on a one-on-one level that's incredibly respectful. And another thing that I kind of mentioned a bit earlier here, don't come calling to me to do work for free for an organization that doesn't matter to me and with leaders that I don't know. I'm an experienced board member and leader. Tell me why I should work for you and your cause for free, because my next board position will be paid. This is huge. I can't tell you how many organizations do this all the time, and I know this because I work for one. Asking for free labor, again, and that goes back to how can you actually mean what you say. So if you put a statement out saying my organization is all about diversity and equity and racial justice and blah, 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 how are you going to show that support? So this is something simple that you can do. And I understand budgets and stuff play in place. So no one's asking for, $1 million donation or huge fees, but there's various ways to show that respect and show that knowledge matters, rather than just, putting something together and being like, we need a diversity and equity person now because of blah, blah, blah. And here, we'd love to reach out to you, even though we don't know you, and all these different things. Like, would you reach out to, I don't know, I can't remember the guy's name right now, the one who found Facebook, him, like, would you reach out to him if, you needed some social media advice, and be like, hey dude, you're so awesome, I love Facebook, and I am wondering if you want to, sit on my board and give me all this expertise. No, you wouldn't, because he's obviously expert in a lot of things, and it's not going to work like that. That's not how the relationship will be. So instead of offending people, please be respectful and consider how to actually have a meaningful relationship. And learn from your mistakes. So this is kind of a little bit of a longer example, but basically this is really big for communicators. So this person is essentially saying that for municipalities in particular, she's saying language is so important, and that's why having an anti-racist lens is so important. So she's saying, when you're talking about the Indigenous community, please don't say our Indigenous community. And she understands that, the language of our or we is very inclusive and supports community, and that's why you're doing it. But it's actually incredibly offensive to the community, because then it's making it seem like you own the community. So that's why it's so important to ensure that you're well versed in what you're writing. It goes back to that education piece, the training piece, that you need to be well aware of what it is that that you're talking about. And this is like a very specific example, but again, learn from your mistakes. If you see comments like this, you need to be well aware and you need to do something about it. And rather than being reactive, you should be proactive. So you should already know this. And this is why having that training and that education is so important. And then be genuine. So here's just some quick Black History Month kind of tweet that I found on the left side here, saying the region of Durham created a Black History Month scavenger hunt activity for employees. And this is incredibly problematic. I apologize for the bad screen capture. It just wasn't a very good image to begin with, but essentially this organization decided to do a scavenger hunt for Black History Month. That's incredibly problematic. Like, one of the things here, week 1, have a conversation with a Black employee. So here's the tweet: I can't stop thinking about all the poor Black employees who had to live through this day. All 3 of them. It's a Durham region. Have a conversation with a Black employee. So you're Black? Yep. How's that going? The usual discrimination. And lots of other things in there as well. Like, again, if it's not genuine, if you haven't done your your education piece, you haven't involved the community, you haven't actually done it properly, then don't do it at all, because it's actually incredibly problematic. And I would encourage you to do it, but rather just do it from a place that actually involves the community and works with the community and is actually going to help, because otherwise it's the same thing as woke washing. You're really not helping the cause. In fact, you're creating more problems than anything. And lastly, the last 2 things here: know your community's values. Here is, like Ramadan Mubarak, it says right there, and then the flavor is smoky bacon. Muslims don't eat bacon, they don't eat pork, so that doesn't make any sense. Happy Vaisakhi here. And a lot of Sikhs are actually vegetarian, and you have, halal meat there. So are you really even thinking about the community and what their needs are? It looks embarrassing. It makes your brand actually look terrible. So it's so important to be aware of your community's values, really going back to that education piece. and understand the seriousness. This is a local Calgary example. There's a local gelato place called Righteous Gelato, and last year around June or July, when with all the protests around Black Lives Matter, they were saying that, hey, we're going to support some local organizations advocating for racialized communities with a small donation if you buy our chocolate mint chip gelato here. And they hired a white artist to create this this art on the piece, and just talking, and they promoted that a lot too, saying that, hey, look, we hired this awesome artist to do this, and now we're going to give to these organizations like 10% or whatever, 5%, whatever it was of our revenue based off of this, not understanding that, hey, asking a white artist to do this is actually very problematic. The amount can be problematic as well. Chocolate, the fact that it's chocolate colored can be problematic as well. There's a lot of history involved here, and if you're not aware of that history and why certain things are problematic, then you're not doing a very good job. And that's where understanding the seriousness is so important. And if you can't do that, if you don't have that, you know, that anti-racism lens. So, you know, I'm really against checklists, because then it makes it feel like you've accomplished something and it's done, when really things like anti-racism work, or really any anti-oppressive work, is not a checklist, but rather an ongoing journey, an ongoing unlearning journey and relearning journey. But I just created sort of like a few things that you can keep in mind in order to create racially aware and culturally competent teams. And there are 8 things here, but essentially diverse staff is probably the biggest thing. And that needs to go beyond tokenism, because you need to understand the value that diversity actually brings, and look for non-diverse spaces in non-traditional spaces. So, you know, expanding beyond the diversity and inclusion chief of director or whatever it is that you may have, because that is very tokenistic. And again, you need to have this type of mentality in different departments. So having just that one person there that's meant to do all this work is not actually super helpful. When you have that diversity in your staff, they can bring those experiences. And again, it doesn't just have to be racial diversity, it could be various forms of diversity. Holding your company accountable. Accountability actually has to bring a shift in the balance of power at the top of the organization and reframe the way that the power is wielded. And this is probably one of the biggest problems that organizations have, because it means that you have to change the way that you do things. And it may mean, you know, some folks have to get a pay cut, or your entire system kind of has to change in a way that works for everyone. But regardless, you have to initiate that change. And change starts at the top. So it needs to start at the corporate structural evolution. So it means like executive leadership must be willing to have this change. So they're really, really key. Transparency. So if companies are determined, you know, with a social justice course of action, then they need to be very transparent about what they're doing and make it very evident in order to win employees' trust as well as stakeholders and clients. And ongoing education. So I've spoken a lot about education, anti-racism training or other types of trainings, and they need to provide these educational foundations and tools for employees to learn those skills in order to operate, you know, beyond just the bystander thing that we were talking about, and, you know, having those important inclusive conversations. And it needs to be ongoing. Say if you've learned something or something has happened, you need to, you know, consistently be coming back, which goes to the last point here, which I'll touch on very soon. And you need to have data-driven action plans. So, you know, after an organization has moved on from solidarity statements, you actually need to have proper action plan, and that needs to have data behind it. You know, you need to monitor it, you need to evaluate it, you need to implement it, and if possible, you need to mitigate the effects of bureaucracy, because they often get in the way of the plan's progress. You need that internal audit, because you need to have that deep institutional commitment at all levels. And lastly, that regular pulse check. So going back to that education piece, or really all these pieces, organizations need to establish systems for regularly making sure, you know, the climate of inclusion is there. And this practice, you know, could include surveys or follow-ups and connections with employees who identify opportunities for improvement, instead of ignoring their concerns. You actually need to listen to them and be part of that solution. So those are just some quick checklists. This is a lot to get through within a short period of time, but that essentially covers my presentation.
Amazing, Iman. Really great information. We have a lot of people on the chat, so I'm really hoping that people have a lot of questions to ask of you. You can type them in the chat or raise your hand, and Chris, and or raise your hand and we can go through one by one.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Hi, thank you so much for that. I guess my question is, if you're in a communications role, and let's say, like in some instances, you might not have so much control over what your company is willing to invest in or make a priority. So if an issue comes up and people are, encouraging you to talk about it, even though you don't have any kind of measurable impact or priority in that, would you recommend just kind of staying away from talking about that publicly?
So you're saying you're a communicator and you don't have that knowledge. So is that your question?
Don't have the knowledge, sorry, but like you wouldn't have, like, you could recommend that you think that your company should invest in certain types of initiatives, but you really don't have that say at the end of the day. But if, let's say, you're being encouraged to acknowledge, something that's going on, but you really can't back it up, would you recommend just staying away from talking about that subject publicly?
No, actually, I wouldn't recommend that. I think we need to be having these conversations. And if you're not having this conversation, that's also going to be seen as problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Which I saw a lot of municipalities in particular during Black History Month not say anything like, it's Black History Month, this is important. But then when George Floyd was murdered, they said, here's our Black square, we care about this. So that's, again, that problematic piece there.
Right.
And that's why I was saying that if you don't have like the higher ups, if you don't have that management's buy-in, it's incredibly hard. But the good thing is, knowledge is essentially free. There are so many resources out there. There's lots on our website, canadiancmf.com. We're actually working on a anti-racism training, 6 weeks, that's free. It's a 6-week training that's meant to help workplaces develop that anti-racism lens in their practice. But there's so many others. Like, for example, if you have to work with the Indigenous community, Indigenous Canada from U of A, it's a course on Coursera that's free. So I think before you dwell into that topic, you actually need to do your research. I just worked with an organization yesterday that wanted to have a land acknowledgement on their website, which is great and awesome. But then they weren't, like, the way that they were handling the situation. They were going to have conversations with elders, and they weren't even aware of the protocols, and it was just very problematic. So I'm happy I was able to chat with them and just further inform them of things that they need to be prepared. But you need to really have there's no excuse anymore to be like, I didn't know any better, because there is so much information out there. So I would recommend doing what you can. Definitely advocate that we need to have more knowledge and whatnot out there, and even search for things. Maybe that can help you advocate within your organization that, hey, here's this free course, or like whatever cheaper course, or whatever it may be. So here are things that we can take. But also, if sometimes you can't say no because it's your job. So then take that time to actually be educated. Yeah.
Thank you.
Iman, we have a question on the chat from Rosabelle, who says, as a volunteer organization, any tips for finding those subject matter expertise?
Definitely. I would say it depends. It depends on what your organization does specifically on a volunteer basis, but there's various different ways to give back that don't necessarily have to be monetary. Although a lot of volunteer organizations do raise money as well, or they get donations. So whether it's like keeping a pool at the end of the year kind of thing, being like, hey, we want to have some sort of subject matter expertise. This is all that we can offer, but at least it's something. Or, maybe whatever it is that your service provides as a volunteer group, you can give back through your service. So there's various different ways to engage in that relationship that's respectful, that doesn't necessarily have to be monetary, but it still is a relationship and it's reciprocal.
Does that help, Roosevelt? Naz, you have your hand up.
Hi, sorry I'm off camera. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's so valuable. So when it comes to companies not being performative and taking the actions that they might, like internal diversity, hiring practices, or donating to social justice organizations, doing diversity and anti-racism training for their companies, how can they communicate about that so that like it doesn't look like they're just rainbow washing and Pride Month, and it not come across as a way that's like very self-centered? I don't know if you have any good examples of how a company can do that, show that they're not being performative.
I would say all year round, make it a priority. And when I say priority, it doesn't mean that every single page that you have on a website or a tweet has to be about a certain topic, but you can certainly highlight things beyond, for like LGBTQ plus awesomeness beyond June. I think that's probably the best way to show your sincerity, whether it's you supporting certain artists, like say if you're an organization that's going to work with an artist to create something that you're working on, whether it's, it's even graphic design or whatever, and you're looking for those diverse artists, and you find whoever it is that you find, like highlight those, let folks know that you are actually doing this work. So then it goes beyond just June or just that logo share. And I also just want to recommend a really, really good service that's actually free. It's called, the organization is called Community Wise. They're a local Calgary organization, a not-for-profit. So if you just search up Community Wise AROC, it's AROC. They have tools and resources for organizations and how they can actually have an anti-racist lens. So they have various different, like trainings, evaluations, learnings that you can do to evaluate your organization, and it's completely free. So really that knowledge is immense out there. There's thousands of resources out there. So I really do recommend that one in specific because I've worked with them several times, but they also do very cheap, training sessions and whatnot as well. So yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Looking through the list, don't see anyone's hands up. Does anyone have any further questions? Oh, Elizabeth TK, I think on the chat, has asked, how do you recommend giving a platform for people to share their lived experiences and stories or elevate their voice without making them feel tokenized by asking them?
I think that really goes back to, there's obviously different organizations. Some might be volunteers. So again, you need to think about what your budget is and whatnot. But I would say probably if you can pay someone, that actually shows a lot. And when I say pay, it doesn't necessarily have to be, like a lot of money, but it's just, hey, you've given me your expertise, you've given me your time, and here's something that I'm giving back to you to show my genuine appreciation. But other than that, again, it really goes back to normalizing and really making it an everyday thing. Representation matters. If you consistently have media out there, whatever it is that you're communicating about, that shows diversity, that actually makes the biggest difference. But the actual reality is when we go on social media or when we look at most organizations' websites or various different forms of communication, it is incredibly white, and that's an absolute fact. And so that's what I mean, like whether it's like physically your website or whatever it may be, or like showing your the programs that you have in place or whatever it may be, it continuously showing that you do value that diversity through various different ways.
Perfect. Thank you. Hopefully that answered your question, Elizabeth. Dana, I see that your hand is up.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that. As an association that was mentioned that volunteer run, and then at a chapter level, at least all of our speakers are volunteer as well, but also recognizing that traditionally underrepresented or marginalized communities, the accessibility and privilege might not be there to be able to access these platforms, and that's where the payment comes from. But then the operational piece of determining who to pay and who not to pay, when traditionally it's been just all volunteer based in terms of presenters. So that's I guess where I struggle with how to approach that.
Are you specifically talking about IBC?
Yeah.
Here?
IABC, yeah. So at least at a chapter level with our professional development events, they're all volunteer, usually from our communities or our partners or connections that we reach out to, but we don't pay for speakers. But I do recognize the importance of that, and not just, yeah. So that's the question.
Again, like if you're able to have a little pool in the end, you can thank them in various different ways. But like I would say, as a fairly well-known organization of communicators, there's so much you can do of like promoting a person's good work on your website, on your social media, saying that here's this awesome speaker. If you want more information about them, here's their website. Please support their work. Like again, it doesn't always have to be monetary. You have a lot of power as an organization. Think, how can I support them? They're giving me their time in terms of whatever it is they're doing for me. I need to make sure I do the same. Otherwise, it does look performative. So that's, I think, a really simple solution that I would recommend.
That's a really good option, I think, Iman. I would also add on to that, is like right now when we want to get this normalized and we want to get the messages out, like just having the opportunity to speak and share that, like, yeah, corporations, you have this opportunity to to become better, and this is how you do it, by reaching out to these organizations. That hopefully is enough of a sell, because based on what I've seen with previous corporations I've worked with, they did not know what to do. Back last year when all this popped up, they were putting out messages that did not resonate, and then the employees, like, they caught on to that immediately and were like, you're saying nothing. And so, like, having this training, having this understanding, and getting aligned with the communications team, that would be so valuable if they were able to be behind that.
Yeah, and I see a lot of, when you apply for jobs or you see job postings, they say if you have an IABC membership, it actually is an asset, or it looks great on your resume. So you have power. Like, folks actually look at you to actually have members that are knowledgeable. So there are so many different ways that you can promote people without having to pay them.
I think a lot to digest, and I know we have a few chapters who are like venturing into including D&I roles on their board. So I think this is a fantastic time to actually talk about this. I know we have 4 minutes left, so I just want to respect the time. Are there any final questions before we adjourn this session?
And if anybody ever wants to reach out, I'll just put my website here again. Certainly can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time today to speak with us and sharing this really important presentation. I think it's on top of everyone's minds right now, especially this month, where there's so many things going on that we should be involved with and be talking about. And something for us to consider as we continue on with our strategic planning as chapters and as an organization. So thank you again. And hopefully, if there's anything else that anyone has, again, you see the website on the chat, reach out, and hopefully we can continue keeping this type of conversation going. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Iman.
Thank you.